In late 2021, Illinois NREC released their latest publication, the Cover Crop Guide. It is a compilation of observation recommendations from research funded by NREC and also draws on experience and expertise from other cover crop practitioners and researchers. Today we have here several of those guests as scientists that have contributed to the guide. Each of these folks bring a unique perspective and have approached their research from varying angles. I'll introduce each of our panelists and then we'll turn it over to them. And as they are going through their presentation, write down your questions. After each of those, we will offer opportunities for questions. And we're going to divide the Q&A up into several categories: cover crop and selection, cover crop seeding and termination, cover crops ahead of corn, cover crops as a part of a total system, and nutrient loss reduction. Welcome, will you, the panelists, Dr. Shalamar Armstrong, Dr. Nick Seiter, Lowell Gentry, John Pike, and Eric Miller. Dr. Shalamar Armstrong is Associate Professor in the Agronomy Department at Purdue University and the Director of a Soil Ecology System and Nutrient Dynamics. He is a regional and multi-scaled research program advocate and educates on the conservation practices such as cover crops and 4R fertilizer management and their impacts on cash crop, water quality, soil health, and economics. Dr. Nick Seiter is a field crop entomologist at the University of Illinois here, where he develops insect management recommendations for corn and soybeans. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in entomology from Purdue and a PhD in entomology from Clemson University. Mr. Lowell Gentry is a principal research scientist specialist in agriculture in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences here at the University of Illinois, where he has been a research scientist for more than 30 years. He received his BS degree in ecology and evolution from the University of Illinois in 1984 and received his MS degree in agronomy from the U of I here in 1992. John Pike lives in Marion and operates Pike Ag, providing consulting and contract research services for the ag industry. He's involved in several NREC research projects related to the nutrient management for southern Illinois, water quality, and cover crops. He was formerly crop sciences superintendent and research agronomist at the U of I at the Dixon Springs Ag Center. He also worked for U of I Extension, served as agronomy instructor at Lakeland Community College in Mattoon, and earlier in his career worked as a certified crop specialist, a CCA, for FS Growmark member companies in Piatt and Christian counties. Eric Miller and his sister Lori own the family farm, Roots Run Deep Farm, located in Piatt County. They grow corn, soybeans, wheat, and cover crops. Illinois Nutrient Research and Education Council-funded research projects have been conducted on-site by the U of I there since 2015. He assists with NREC plots in Douglas County. Please welcome, as a group, your panelists.
Okay, so thank you, Julie and Shani and NREC for inviting us, I think I could say that for all of us, to be your cover crop panel. We were asked to give a couple of thoughts to kind of just probe the room, to generate some questions and that are related to what we've been observing in our research and in on-farm interactions as it pertains to cover crops. And one of the things I want to start off with was looking at the potential of using overwintering cover crops, overwintering legume cover crops as an alternative to cereal rye before corn. When I started out, year one, NREC was funded me all the way up to now, and if you know me, a theme of my research is a focus on cereal rye and how it affects nitrogen cycling, availability, and fate. And one thing that we found with cereal rye before corn is that with the high seeding ratio carbon to nitrogen ratio of the residue, it causes nitrogen immobilization, meaning that the microbes, they begin to break down and decompose the residue, and if they don't find enough nitrogen in the residue itself, they go to the soil solution, takes that nitrogen away from where the plants have to be supplied. And so there becomes a deficit of nitrogen. So we tried with different ways of planting the cereal rye, different seeding rates, but we still kept coming up with about a 6% yield lag. And so I got tired of farmers saying, why are you doing this? And obviously I was doing it for the nutrient loss reduction benefits. So then again, to look at Balanza clover. I was approached to study this particular plant. It's an overwintering legume for 3 years now. It has overwintered every time we planted it. It's very small in the fall. You can't really see it, but then grows vigorously in the spring. We have seen from northern Indiana, Illinois to the south, we've seen a range of 1,000 to 3,500 pounds per acre of biomass. In that biomass, we've seen a range of about 70 to upwards to 250 pounds per acre of nitrogen. And so the idea now is to determine how much that nitrogen actually gets and cycles into the corn crop. And so just briefly, when we added no nitrogen, we see significantly greater bushels per acre for corn following Balanza clover relative to cereal rye. That's number one. So if we just select another cover crop, we got greater yield, and that's with no nitrogen added. And then it was equal or greater than the control. So we saw that was great potential. So that's the first bullet point. The second is that when you think about, we talked about phosphorus a lot, cover crops and their interaction with phosphorus, we found of late, one of my PhD students found that all cover crop species are not created equal. So we found that any cover crop species that does not overwinter exacerbates the phosphorus loss problem as far as surface runoff. So you're talking about the combination of radish, oats, and so forth. They mine phosphorus from the lower depths. Then when they winter kill, they deposit that phosphorus on the surface. And we found that the first, let's say, 5 centimeters of soil is what interacts with surface runoff. And so if you have like no-till, your phosphorus is already concentrated there. And then when you add this cover crop that winter kills, it's adding to the concentration. Further, we found that cereal rye would significantly reduce that phosphorus loss in runoff. And then annual rye. How many are annual rye fans? In here, I'll talk to a couple, okay? He's bold about it, right? Annual rye, it significantly reduces phosphorus loss and phosphorus desorption. We think that's occurring because it's mining phosphorus and it puts more energy into its roots, which is below the runoff zone. The last bullet point that I want to leave with you is how cover crops impact nutrient loss. We've seen over the last 7 or 8 years a reduction of nitrogen loss, nitrate loss via tile drainage of about 39 to upwards to 50%. Okay, the nutrient loss reduction strategy says you can get about a 30% reduction, but we're seeing greater than that on average. Even when we added another 60 pounds of nitrogen to kind of offset what the cereal rye takes, we still saw a 39% reduction in nitrate loss relative to the control that had no cover crops and 60 pounds less of nitrogen added. So I think that's a check mark among, we scientists can pat ourselves on the back. I think we've studied that to a point where we can confidently say at least grass cover crops are significant scavengers of nitrogen and causes there to be a significant loss in nitrogen via tile drainage. At this point, I'm going to pass it to Nick.
All right, thanks, y'all. So I'm a field crop entomologist here, actually just down the road, University of Illinois. With my work, oh, it's up there already. Oh, how'd it do that? It's magic. It's magic. Great job. Great job, whoever did that. So what we've been looking at in cover crops is really just what's the risk of insect damage? What's the risk of having to deal with an extra insect pest in these cover crop systems? What we've looked at more than any other system, of course, has been cereal rye ahead of soybean, because that's the most commonly used in Illinois right now. Additional risk of that isn't nothing, but it's not much. It doesn't increase the risk of insect damage dramatically in that system. As you start to look more broadly at insect management in front of cover crops, so the more closely related your cover crop is to your cash crop, the more likely you are to have an issue there. So if we have rye ahead of corn and those two are present fairly close together, risk might be a little higher. Looked in one of Lowell's trials, actually a couple of Lowell's trials over several years, and couldn't find any insect damage to speak of in corn. And most of that was terminated well before the corn was planted. Boy, we went out there and looked hard for insect damage in corn in your trials, and we couldn't find hardly any. It was nice and clean. When we look at overall pests that are going to be the most problematic in there, to be honest, most of them are non-insects, and the one that can really give people trouble, especially if you go down into the heavy no-till areas in southern Illinois, would be slugs. This isn't a situation where cover crops necessarily create a slug problem that wasn't already there. You can certainly have a pretty serious slug problem in continuous no-till production without a cover crop. When you look at that residue management and having additional moisture out there in the field, what really drives slug issues is moisture. I mean, that's going to be the primary driving factor there. So that's one certainly to be vigilant for. Few people have noted voles in kind of the same system. Voles aren't an insect. I think probably most of y'all are aware of that. I'm probably about as useful for getting rid of those as you would imagine I would be, given where my expertise is. I've heard dogs suggested, that kind of thing. They can be pretty problematic. When we talk about insect pests, armyworms are one that comes up and is definitely attracted to cereal rye, and one that we've had a field sprayed for armyworms in this study. Had a couple of other fields that had some issues, even some stand loss issues on the edges of the field. The good thing about the true armyworm, the one that we get early in the season, not the fall armyworm that we got late in the season this last year. Good thing about true armyworm is it is a grass specialist. It is attracted to grasses. That's where it's going to be found. It'll chew on soybeans, though, and if you have enough of them, you can come into an issue there. But as long as you're keeping those plants alive, as long as you're not losing stand, you're okay with that little bit of chewing on there. Other than that, what else? Anything else to cover in insects before I give it to y'all? Mostly what I'll tell you is, if I were managing these things, I'd manage them for the agronomics, for the nutrient loss reduction. Worry about the insects as they come up. We've got some insect problems out there, but they're nothing we can't manage. Yep, stink bugs. You can find some stink bugs in there occasionally. Where we would see that as more of a problem typically would be in corn. I know we walked that field down at Junior Updikes, right? A few years ago, we had a pretty good stink bug population in corn. And usually when we think about stink bug management, we're thinking about it in soybean at potting. I don't think a stink bug's going to do much to a soybean plant as it's coming up, but it can do considerable damage to corn as it's spiking. So that's something to watch as well. In terms of what's bringing them in there, there's some evidence they'll actually overwinter in some rye fields. In some cases, if you have something out there that's either set in a pod or putting on a flower or a seed, you could bring stink bugs in. The good news in corn, once you get past that spiking, once you get a little bit of size on it, you're kind of out of the woods there. And it's not something we've seen often, but it's something we've seen a time or two. I'll turn it over, I guess. You're next in line on the thing, so I guess you're next in line on the slides.
Slide is there. Well, you just immortalized Junior Updike as a Upton. Oh, well, I should have said it wrong, because as a purveyor of stink bugs, Oh, well, he'll live it down, I'm sure. So I have been saying to people for the last 30-some years that I'm a nitrogen scientist because I think of nitrogen cycling. And I used to think of carbon too. You know, I've had a hypothesis that there's less net mineralization following corn than following soybean, and that's getting at carbon, and that's getting at the C to N ratio of the residue. But since I've been working on cover crops in the last decade or more, it's made me think of carbon as well as nitrogen. And we've sort of decoupled the carbon and nitrogen cycles after World War II when we went with straight fertilizer, nitrogen, and we no longer were relying on animal manure as much, and so we were putting nitrogen on, but not with carbon anymore. And so we've got a leaky system. We need tile drainage, but we find plenty of nitrate in our tiles, and we find plenty of it after soybean as well. So overwintering cover crops are one of the ways we're investigating trying to reduce that tile nitrate load. And when I talk about this mineralization, I really am talking about net mineralization. So that's a tug of war between mineralizing and liberating nitrate versus the microbes in the soil taking it up, immobilizing it. And so this first photo I have here is what we found over time. This is the minimum amount of cereal biomass you need to statistically see a reduction in tile nitrate. You know, anything will help, but this is a half a ton per acre of above ground biomass. And that'll have 25 to 30 pounds of nitrogen in it. And so if we're stripping through this, strip tilling, then you would need more biomass. But this is ahead of soybean, and we have no problem with cereal rye ahead of soybean. In fact, we've pushed the envelope at Eric Miller's farm, and this is Eric planting green into standing cereal rye, that second picture. And that's more like 2.5 tons of above ground biomass. That's a lot. And there you might actually get some weed suppression at that level. Well, he had no problem with his soybean yield at that amount. So I'm willing to say safely that anywhere between 0.5 ton and 2.5 tons per acre of above ground biomass is safe in front of soybean. And when we have 2.5 tons of biomass per acre, that tile nitrate is around 1 part per million or even less. And what's coming out of a conventional field at that time is 5 to 10 part per million. So we greatly reduce the tile nitrate. Now the last picture, and Shalamar has clearly alluded to the problem of having cereal rye in front of corn. We've seen the same yield drag that he has seen. And so this is what we want it to look like. If we're going to use cereal rye in front of corn, because there is more risk, you have to be able to kill it when you want to, and we think you should have 2 weeks between termination and crop growth, and we strip tilled through the cereal rye in the fall. And now that is the 0.5 ton of biomass per acre with the strips. And that's what you'd want it to look like, and that's right before planting. That was 2 weeks after termination. So now that I think of carbon, I think that we should have less tillage on our soils, because tillage aerates the soil, gets the microbes excited, and they liberate more nitrate. So less tillage, and the other way is add carbon through cover cropping. Those two ways are the ways that we can get more carbon in the system. And I think if we have more carbon in the system, the tile nitrate problem will be lessened by that. So I think more of myself as carbon nitrogen scientist.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. And as I scan the audience there, and I've taken some pictures up here because I've got an 8-year-old niece, and she doesn't believe that I go places and people actually sit and listen to me talk. She said this weekend, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, Abby, I've got to go to Champaign." "Why do you go there?" "Well, I'm going to talk with some people." And she said, "Why would anybody listen to you?" So feel free, you don't have to, but it's great to be here. And as I look around, I must be getting older. I guess I am old because I know at least one person, I think, at every table out here. So that's a good thing. But just a few of the things that I'd like to bring to light. I think that as I work with a number of cover crop growers across southern Illinois and a bigger part of the state on any given day, and I get called on a lot of the worst case scenarios. So problems have risen, and what do we do about these things? And one of the biggest things that I see is almost every case that I am involved with a cover crop challenge or where something went wrong, there's a 99% chance that cover crop was introduced to an agronomic system, whether it's corn or beans, as just merely another input. It wasn't thought about as part of a system, and how do we manage that? And I think that's a big thing. When we adopt a cover crop into a system, we need to have a plan to manage that. They can be very effective, and we can accomplish a lot of goals with these. Nutrient management is one of these things. We can see a lot of other benefits that we won't get into right now, but we need to have a plan about how to manage that. So I think that's key. I think another thing, wherever we're at in the state, there has been a move over the last several years to an earlier soybean planting management system. And I think that opens up a huge opportunity to do a better job of managing our cover crop system ahead of corn. That's where our major challenges are. We can plant cover crops, we can plant beans into that cover crop, and with a little bit of planning and not much luck, we can do a good job of raising a good competitive crop, and a lot of times better with some of the moisture conservation aspects of the cover crop system. But corn is our big factor, and we've already alluded to some of the carbon-nitrogen ratio and those types of issues. But I think that if we can use the soybean system where we plant early to where we're harvesting early, that gives us a wider window to get that cover crop established in the fall. We can establish a more diverse cover crop, or we can get some clovers that they'll establish in September, the first week of October, and we don't have that luxury to make that work as we get later into October and the 1st of November, especially if we get in this geography here. And along with what Lowell said, I think that a big opportunity to make corn work better is to pair cover crop systems with strip till, especially in this area. We've got black soils that are well drained, and they have the ability to warm up and give us that planting window early. But if we've got a solid seeded cover crop on that, we keep the soils colder and we keep them wetter longer. But if we pair that tillage in the strip and manage that along with the cover crop, I think that opens up a lot of windows for us to have a lot of success as we move down the road. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
We've got a great panel today. I will not take a whole lot of time here. My slide kind of describes what I will be talking about today. I have worked with Lowell since 2015. I like to kid him. When I started, I did not have gray hair. Today, I do have gray hair. My research says there's a strong correlation between those two. He might say you're 50 years old now and your dad has gray hair, but I'm not sure. So that's been a pleasure. I would just like to also ask, I've seen a few, how many actual farmers do we have out here today? All right, so we got about 10 or so. So I will probably be able to help you folks a little bit more. I will talk, and John also touched on this. John and I will be able to help with the actual implementation of putting cover crops into a typical, cash grain system. We have done, obviously, economic analysis every year on our research, so I have a lot of information on that. Yeah, so we do have a couple of good posters today. So I guess those would be the main highlights. And then also, we got this wrong. We called this the cover crop guide. I now feel that 10 years ago we should have called these service crops because I think they do a lot of different things that we don't talk about. And that's not my term. We had a visitor from Argentina this past summer at our farm, and he says down there they call them service crops. And I think he came up with about was 20 or 21 or 22 services they provide. So I think we need to think of cover crops, obviously as nutrient research reduction, which is what we're doing here, but also many other benefits. So with that, I guess we'll get after the questions.
Let's start with you, Eric, since you were just speaking. What about your timing and what's optimal for your cover crops, and give us, kind of what you've seen?
So I had started with cover crops, service crops. Is it going to catch on? Anybody? No, probably not. In 2011, so I've got quite a bit of experience there, we tried many different applications to be successful in establishing those. In a corn-soy rotation, cover crops can be a bit of a challenge just because, we're not sure when our harvest window will be. So I think our research kind of led us to trying to be more timely. So for example, we are now, we have an air seeder on our corn head. So as we are harvesting corn, we are now also broadcasting our cereal rye seed. That has greatly sped up the timing of that crop. It's so important to get that established in the fall. I remember when I started with cover crops, I heard someone say, 1 day of growth in September is equal to 3 days in October. So we really need to be timely with this. And obviously, in our geography, we are harvesting corn. End of September is a real frequent time. So that is something that we have done to.
And I'll come over there. And Shalamar, you touched on this a little bit on expanding beyond just cereal rye. So a lot of our first work has been on cereal rye, but can you talk a little bit about some of the other crops that you're looking at? Kind of, you can all weigh in on that.
Yeah. So definitely, I think when we speak of a system, we need to think about cover crops being integrated into the conventional system. And one of the things that I've found is that we do better agronomically. We're still trying to see if we can do this environmentally with rotating the cover crop with the cash crop, right? So if you're going into, let's say, soybean, which can fix nitrogen, so nitrogen immobilization is not such a negative impact relative to corn. You can have a cover crop like cereal rye or angel rye that produces residue that has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, as Lowell talked about. So the higher that number is, if it's above 24, the slower the decomposition and the decoupling of nitrogen from carbon will occur, right? And the lower that number is, the faster the decomposition and the more cycling the nitrogen will have going into the cash crop out of the cover crop residue. So we like to rotate. If you had the perfect world, perfect system, I think you would want to rotate. Before beans, you could go with a high seeding ratio cover crop, like a grass. And then before corn, if you can get it planted timely, you can go with a overwintering legume, right? And if you have some precision, skip the corn row type deal, where you're planting and you have strips, and you can come in and plant and then terminate a little later to get more growth. You could have a system like a 4x1 relay, right? It passes the baton of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur equitably, right? Instead of having the immobilization.
I agree with everything that Shalamar said. I think that one thing that a lot of the growers that I work with have been doing more and more is not, when we're studying a cover crop, to have just cereal rye or to just have clover out there, it makes a lot of sense to look at the single species. I think that as we look to anything but cereal rye, we need to be mindful of the ability of that cover crop or whatever's in that mix to overwinter. And I've found in a lot of cases that even though the cereal rye can cause some nitrogen issues ahead of corn. To have that in a mix with a clover species or hairy vetch, that can help a lot with the overwintering of that legume, because if we've got the legume establishing there and we're a little bit late, and that's all that's growing out there, it's very susceptible to whatever the weather throws at us. But if we've got some grass, and with cereal rye especially, or an oat being a bigger seed, it's going to tend to sprout and establish quicker, and that little bit of growth can really give a lot of insulation and help the overwintering chances of that legume. And then in times when we get to the point and we're going to transition that field into corn, more and more we're looking at an early termination and taking the grass species out of that cover crop mix. So that gets that out earlier than what you would to get your 1.5 tons of residue with the cereal rye, but then let that legume grow up to where your carbon nitrogen ratio is a little bit more easy to handle in there. But I think that using the mix and then managing that mix to get the results that you can want can really have a big impact.
Yeah. In addition, when you think about, so what was the first service that we found the use of cover crops for? The first service was not nutrient loss reduction, it was what? Soil erosion, right? And if you go a single monoculture of, let's say, clover, right, bonanza clover, in the fall, you really can't see it, right? And it puts on its growth mostly in the spring. So having a portion of your mixture to be cereal rye or annual rye, that you can get some fall growth, you get some erosion protection there also. You also get nutrient uptake, right, scavenging. And then in the spring, that clover will outgrow. It could possibly outgrow that cereal rye or that annual rye, and then because it's dominant, it'll result in on average, a lower C/N ratio going into your corn, right? So I was just adding to that.
One quick comment, Kay Shipman, could you take a picture of John Pike the next time he's talking, like in the back of the room, and you could send that to his niece? They were all listening to you, John. I looked out. You did a great job.
No hashtags.
Have any of you folks had seen any consistent results from an aerial approach to seeding, late August, early September? In particular, I work with growers north of I-80, just kind of a tough window for time frame to get established. Was just wondering what your results have been with the aerial approach.
I think aerial seeding is fine. I think that it's important that way that you play the rains, because you're very susceptible to, and it's not just any rain too. I've seen a lot of situations where people will call the airplane because there's rain in the forecast. They'll make the application and it's not enough rain to establish, and we'll get germination of that seed on the soil surface. It germinates, and then there's not enough moisture to carry it through. So if we've got I always tell guys in my area that call the plane when the hurricane comes up the Mississippi, because but aerial seeding works great, and even for high clearance airflow type application, those things can be very effective, but we need to make sure that we've got the moisture to establish those.
John, speak to the, I was going to have him speak to it, but there's also a science behind if you apply the seed and into soybean, right? One of the things that I learned early as a young researcher, I wanted to wait until all of the leaves have fallen off the soybean plant, and then it's covering, and I was like, oh, it's ready now, right? When I have 70% leaf drop. Well, that was a mistake, because if the leaves are dropping off the soybean, the leaves are covering the soil surface. And if I'm dropping the seed from the airplane, I don't have enough terminal velocity for the seed to go through the mat of leaves, then to get to the soil. So actually, I think I've learned, and we've been effective on a watershed scale, of dropping the seed in from the airplane when I start seeing the cereal rye turn, right, and no more than 25% leaf drop. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, good point, because the leaf drop of the soybeans can help play the moisture management in our effort too. I think I would say with that though, that we want to be mindful too of, we've not said anything about herbicide interactions, but before we even think about getting a strategy together about what species or the timing of seeding, we want to make sure that our herbicide program in the crop year leading up before that cover crop seeding, that we don't have chemistry involved that's going to terminate the cover crop too. So I've seen that a lot of cases where everybody's got a great idea. They've got a truckload of seed, we've got the airplane or we've got the drill, and we go out there and seed it. And especially with a lot of the emphasis in the bean year of being to control the pigweed species and all the problems that we're having there, the tendency is to have a later season post-application and mix some type of residual chemistry in there. And some of those residual chemistries that work on the small seeded broadleaf that give good control of that, they can also control clovers and rapeseed and a lot of those other things that we get. So, don't outsmart yourself ahead of time. Make sure you've got a plan from, if we're going to seed a cover crop in the fall, let's make sure that everything is in line to get the best out of that at this point, because that can make a lot of difference.
Yeah, John, I would follow up when you say have a plan. I would second that. As a producer, and I'm not originated with this, but one of the things that we've seen economically is that fungicides tend to pay for themselves. So now we're fungiciding a lot of these beans, and my experience and a lot of others is that when we fungicide the beans, we delay harvest a week or 10 days, sometimes 2 weeks. So we're, from the economic side, we're doing the best management practice to protect that plant, but we're also delaying whatever we want to do as a cover crop and losing a couple weeks of time to get that cover crop established and up. So that's just one of the things is all of our production practices change. It just seems to throw up more roadblocks, and when we delay that planting time, we lose that first 2 weeks. So that's just an observation that I hear a lot of producers in my area, like, I'm putting on fungicide now, so I'm losing my window of opportunity because now I'm back to the middle of October. And I guess the other thing is with me, I'm kind of a little bit of a rebel. I consider wheat for harvest to be a acceptable cover crop. And I've got a lot of highly erodible ground, and I want to put a wheat crop there and harvest it. And then I'm coming back with my double crop beans, and I think that is just the most ideal situation to raise beans in, both from water quality and soil erosion. So not everybody approves of that practice, but it's the same way. When I fungicide my beans, then the fly date in my county is 5 to 7 of October, so now I'm planting wheat the middle of October, and that just causes more problems. So I think I'm interested in your reaction as the fungicides. I think eventually most of the beans are going to be fungicide, and we're going to delay harvest. So when you say have a plan, I'm going to have to plant 3-0 beans instead of 4-0 beans. So thinking this through is probably a positive thing, and you all may have different reactions to my problems and situations, but the fungicide thing I think is here to stay in this delay in harvest.
Yeah, you point to the reality of things, Don. There's no doubt about that. Number one, as far as I'm concerned, the more wheat acres that we can have, that's a part and a key into the nutrient loss issue. And if we can have a cash crop worked into that, that's fine. I think the reality of that is that we're not going to have all of our acres in the winter have wheat on there. So if we've got wheat on some acres and some farms, we've got a cover crop plan on something else on those other farms. What can we do to maybe look at an earlier maturing bean planted earlier to kind of key in on those things? And it's a whole operational planning system. It's just not what kind of cover crop we're going to plant and how we're going to spew it out there. So but the wheat is a good part of this. And I've been at this for quite a while, and the more posters that I look at and the more meetings that I come to, it all boils down to having a sound nitrogen management system, more acres of cover crop, more acres of wheat or of small grain, and less tillage. And those 4 things right there take us a long way to get to the goals of what we're all involved in. So we can chew it up and spit it out a lot of different ways, but that's the rough part of it.
And I think if I can just add in, and maybe Lowell and Eric can talk to this, one of the projects that NREC has funded is an extended rotation, looking at a corn, soybean, wheat rotation. And I think there's great data from an economic standpoint and from an agronomic standpoint and also from an environmental standpoint. So if you guys want to talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll start that off. I met a guy that would entertain growing wheat in central Illinois, so that was the first good move I made. Yeah, and yeah, he was using it as a trick to get the tiling contractor out there earlier than the corn and soybean farmers, but nonetheless. But anyway, we have a corn, soybean, wheat rotation versus conventional corn, soybean, and that corn, soybean, wheat rotation has cereal rye after corn. And so if we just count the number of months that were covered up in those two systems, we're covered up 30 out of 36 months in the corn, soybean, wheat rotation, because I also consider winter wheat, as occupying the space of a cover crop, and so that's covered up, service crop. So 30 out of 36 months in corn, soybean, wheat, and only 10 out of 24 months in corn, soybean, conventional. And so I think the 800-pound gorilla is soil erosion, and that's the thing that's the one existential thing that could undermine us, and other civilizations have gone down because of loss of soil. So when I heard the first speaker today talk about more intense rainfalls, all I'm thinking is more soil erosion. And so cover crops great for that. In fact, it's funny you mentioned the hurricane, John. That was the best cover crop I've grown, was when the hurricane hit over Labor Day, and we got 6 inches of rain. That really gets a cover crop going, by the way. And so, but as far as aerial seeding, it's very hit and miss for us, unfortunately, and it's did it rain enough when you wanted it to? And so in research, we try and make sure we have a good stand. And so we moved away from aerial application. But I could see, like, maybe before corn, maybe I don't need as heavy a stand. Maybe I would try aerial seeding, but in front of soybean, I'd be happy to drill it, make sure I got an excellent stand because I want to plant green. So there's my thoughts.
Well, excuse me, Don, you are a halfway smart guy, I think. So I would agree with you on many, many aspects of how do you make this work. And I guess my example on maturity dates would be just that. So when we went to this corn, soy, wheat rotation, we had to plant wheat and get that established. Well, the first week of October is a great time to get it planted and established. So what we had to do was go from a 3.6 maturity to a 4.0 maturity bean, kind of in that range, down to a 3.0, 3.1, 3.2. Do we lose yield by going to a shorter maturity? I don't think so. It's just tougher. There might be 3 good 3.2 maturity beans, and you might have 10 high-yielding 4.0 maturity beans. It's just a little bit more tricky. But, that is, you bring up a good point. There's a lot of details that need to be ironed out. I think the cover crop guide has, got a lot of good information in it. We tried to be very detailed. That's why it's so many pages, but we don't want, 1 or 2 important items to be left out so people fail. And I think at this point, Nick would maybe take a question on voles as well.
That'd be great, yeah.
So when I listen to the presentations, usually what comes into my mind is technology transfer, okay? One thing is having these excellent innovations. The next thing is trying to transfer this knowledge to other terrain or other places where, of course, could be applied. So I predominantly come from a place that is known to be wet or has, most of the time, the soils are usually wet. So my question is specifically directed to Dr. Nick that talked about wet seasons or wet soils, and then knowing how best to consider introducing the cover crops, especially since issues related to slugs are usually felt in terms of pest management. So my concern is what are the considerations for the timing introducing this cover crop? Because my place, most of the times, is always wet, and we have to think about ways of improving the system so as to maximize or optimize the profits.
Well, on the slug side, it does get tough in some of those fields. I'm going to just stand so I'm looking at you, but it does get tough in some of those fields. I know, was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 2019, very wet spring. I think you all remember that quite well. And you know, the thing to do on slugs most of the time, if you've got them established in the field already, is you wait till it dries out. Well, gosh, it's hard to tell a guy to do that June 10th, you know, when we were talking about planting soybeans. And I believe that was planted, I can't remember the first time. It was late May, early June, and then we're talking about a replant in June 10th. Some of the tillage techniques, if you can get into the field, anything to help that bean plant come out of the ground quicker. But once you've got slugs, it's pretty tough to get rid of them, you know, without in that year. Over time you can. Obviously, tillage works great. That's not often what we want to hear. You know, it does tend to be a long-term no-till problem. Waiting for conditions to be right when you can do that. But it's tough. You know, you get guys talking about things like putting nitrogen out at night while the slugs are out to try and salt them. And that gives you an idea of how desperate some of these guys will get. And that's not just a cover crop thing. That tends to be a no-till thing in general. It does tend to be localized. You're not likely to get them to where, like, you haven't had slugs in the past and all of a sudden this year you've got loads and loads of slugs. Like, it tends to build up in these fields over time. But managing that residue and anything you can do to get the crop out of the ground fast is your best bet. There's a few bait products out there. They'll work on some of the really rough spots, the low spots in the field and that kind of thing. They're expensive. You got to get great coverage with them. They're not easy to get a hold of in general in southern Illinois. I don't know if you've had any experience with the baits at all, or it's hard to find somebody who's got experience. Yeah. The cost to efficacy ratio is usually a little bit out of whack on those.
I think in 2019 that Nick referred to, there was a lot of beans that were planted in the middle of May in that year. I mean, just a bunch of them that went in about a 5 to 7 day period. And it was warm. All the conditions were right too. The soil conditions were right. The temperatures were warm. It was good and hot. We got a good 5 or 7 day run. A lot of crops were planted. And then we got a 2.5 inch rain over a big stretch of Illinois and over into Indiana and Missouri. And it soaked the ground. And with that front, there wasn't anything to kick that cold air out. So it stayed wet. We had a big rainfall over a lot of acres. We had the temperatures cooled off, because I can remember in that year I was finishing up planting some of my plots on Memorial Day weekend, and I was wearing a long sleeve shirt and a sweatshirt and getting calls, you know, right after left. But I think the big thing with the slugs is it's very environmentally variable. And if you can get it planted and the conditions are for good, speedy crop emergence and development, most of the time, your beans especially are going to outgrow the slugs. Where we have problems is when we get that cold, wet snap and the plant's just sitting there waiting for the right conditions, then we can have some feeding on that. So the environmental conditions are big. One of the other things is that I know a lot of people that have had better luck in bad slug years planting beans green rather than early termination, because when you've got a field and it has slug pressure in it, if you kill that green vegetation that's got them there in the first place, and then you go in and you plant a bean crop and you've got that new lush material growing up, that's what they're going to target into. So that's another thing. And was there another question about you had wet conditions and getting a cover crop established in that? I think that the ability to withstand wetness, especially in the fall when it's cold and coming into the spring anyway, is very species specific. So we have conditions, and we've got a lot of variability, or more variability in the southern part of the state than we do a lot of this. And cereal rye, for example, it's a very durable cover crop, but it doesn't do well in wet areas. In fields like that, the grass species would be more suited to be an annual ryegrass, because annual ryegrass, I've had fields of that have been flooded with water standing over it 9 times between the time I planted it in the fall and the time we got in the field to plant in the spring, and there was some of that survived. So look for a species that has the ability to withstand that, because every cover crop and every cover crop mix isn't suited for every acre. So just keep that in mind.
I think we have time for one more quick question here.
With the combined experience of the group, is there one nitrogen management scenario that can help corn overcome the nitrogen deficit you see with cereal rye? Is there one clear nitrogen management scenario that you've seen to be most effective?
Maybe 2. Early termination and a starter fertilizer close to the plant. What are we thinking? 30 to 50. I'm thinking in the 50. When I'm planting into a cover crop, I want to have about 50 pounds of starter in there.
I would add, so you said the first one is early termination 2 weeks before planting. Second, at least 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen on the plant, and probably some phosphorus. And sulfur wouldn't hurt, because that also gets immobilized. And I would say a third would be a third and a fourth. The third would be if you could precision plant that cereal rye. We've found that precision planted corn growing in precision planted cereal rye that has non-cereal rye intersecting growing zones, you do better with nitrogen acquisition, uptake, and yield. Then the third, if you're able to, we have found some luck with adding a little bit more nitrogen back to the system, knowing that the cereal rye has taken some of the nitrogen that your corn would depend on from the soil. So we came back with a Y drop at about V10, and we got significantly greater yield. And at the same time, we had the same nutrient loss reduction percentage of about 39% relative to the plots where we didn't add the extra nitrogen. And so that's kind of like the thought pattern of if you're going corn, most farmers know you can't add the same nitrogen. Got to add a little bit more.
I think in my experience, when we're talking about corn, it's a learning process. So from the starting gate, we want to be conservative and have our termination plan a little bit on the early side, because whenever we pick up some of the ag publications, what do we see? We see cover crops that are this tall and hear about planting green and all these great things, and it's from someone that has experience from that. They didn't start out last year and decide we're going to do this. So there's a lot of good stories to hear and a lot of good strategies and plan, but those are things that most of us that are starting out of the gate on day one need to work to. So we want to make it manageable. So if we can lean to earlier, or on the early side of termination, and then make sure that we lean on the early side of nitrogen supply, and that's close to the plant, not put on 30-inch centers pre-plant or in the wintertime. Those are the big things. And then it's also been my experience in that as people have success with those conservative first couple of steps into the process, then they'll say, well, gosh, that worked good last year, so let's wait a week on termination this year. Let's do this, and then they'll work into those things that you see the grand pictures of in in the magazines. And just because things come out in an article or on a TV program that work great in Ohio or South Dakota or someplace, they might not be suited to your farm, because we're not in Ohio or South Dakota. So just keep that in mind, and you can learn locally in a lot of cases.
A lighter sear rod stand too. If you want to go sear right before corn, you could possibly cut your seeding rate in half, right? And so you have less carbon to immobilize that nitrogen.